Hello, my name is Nathan Brummel, and I hope you're having a great day. Today I want to continue to talk to you about urban missions in part 3. And today we want to talk about some of the things that occurred in the late 1800s and the early part of the 19th century that shaped how evangelical Protestants were engaging the cities at the end of the 20th century and then now at the beginning of the 21st century. Roger Greenway talks about how there were some helpful innovations that happened in the late 19th century in what he says could be called the institutional church. He's talking about how there was a church-centered combination of spiritual and social ministry geared toward the needs of the urban poor. Now, this was a praiseworthy thing. Notice how it is church-centered. Greenway is distinguishing this from just organizations or what we would call faith-based organizations, simply arising up on the part of Christians and trying to do many good things. Here he's talking about how actual churches as institutes, tried to reach out to the urban poor. Now, some of these outreaches involved innovation where Christians were being entrepreneurial, they were being creative in their application of Christian principles to the real life needs of the inner city poor. For example, one thing that you find at the end of the 1800s is the rise of Sunday schools for children. There was also the rise of rescue missions for the down and out. In fact, rescue missions were at the heart of the creative ministry of institutional churches. And so you find the rise of city rescue missions. You also have missions that are reaching out to women. The Salvation Army had a body and soul approach to missions. They wanted to deal with people's physical needs as well as their spiritual needs. There were also homes for fallen girls, that is, women who became pregnant out of wedlock. And they had, or women who had fallen into prostitution. There were also homes for women who had fallen into prostitution. And these places were called homes for fallen girls. And they had a rehabilitation success rate of 90%. So they were very effective. But the dream of bringing multitudes and multitudes of the urban poor into the membership of evangelical churches never occurred. Protestant churches at the end of the 1800s remained weak and frustrated in many urban centers, and it seemed like only a small minority of urban dwellers were reached. But the percentage of recipients of Word and Deed ministries who became confessing Christians also remained very small. Now, one problem was, too, the lack of the planting of self-sufficient and self-propagating churches in inner cities. And so by the end of the 19th century, there was a level of frustration that had set in. People weren't sure what was going wrong, but there was widespread disillusionment with urban missions. Roger Greenway says that many church people questioned whether urban mission work, particularly in the form of organized church activity, was worth the trouble. And then another thing that contributed to the problem is that as the 20th century arrived, theological liberals advocated the social gospel. They were more interested in redeeming society than human beings. And so urban outreach by liberals became humanitarian aid, mere humanitarian aid. They weren't into bringing the blood theology of Christ crucified. So the good news of Jesus Christ was not told. Now, the problem with liberalism, according to Greenway, is this: there must be the oral and intelligible communication of salvation's message, or there is no evangelism. Greenway says, presence must never be made a substitute for proclamation. Both are necessary. Now, he says that because sometimes in the 20th centuries, Christians have acted as if just mere presence was somehow enough. For example, the Roman Catholic priest who is portrayed in Dominique Lapierre's famous book, The City of Joy, thought that his mere presence in an Indian slum was sufficient. Since social action came to be identified with liberalism, the problem is that biblical Protestants were skeptical of deeds of mercy. So Protestantism wasn't at home in the city yet. It didn't know how to reach the urban poor especially. Now, the majority of confessionally Reformed and Presbyterian churches in America are located either in suburban churches or in smaller towns and cities. But however, in the beginning of the 20th century, there has been a return to the cities and to large urban centers on the part of some Presbyterian and Reformed churches. For example, the Presbyterian Church in America is now planting churches in urban centers like Detroit and Chicago. And they were influenced by the ministry of Tim Keller in Manhattan at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, which provided a model for urban church plants in the city. And there are two things that have characterized Keller's approach to urban missions. One is his emphasis on bringing the gospel with deeds of mercy. But the other thing is his apologetic style and his desire to find a point of contact with millennials or the urban young, who many times are very secular and atheistic, and to try to find a point of contact in the preaching of the gospel to them. In other words, try to be all things to all men within the urban context. And this has become a model even for churches overseas. In fact, once when I was in Taiwan lecturing at China Reformed Theological Seminary in Taipei, I was struck by the fact that when I attended a Presbyterian church in Taipei, the sermon could have been delivered by Keller. In fact, the sermon very closely followed Keller's method of how to communicate the gospel to urban dwellers. That church was very consciously trying to imitate Redeemer Presbyterian's approach to apologetics and ministry. I think that a problem that's closer to home for many Reformed and Presbyterian churches is even knowing how to evangelize in the suburbs. Many Reformed and Presbyterian churches are located in smaller towns or villages, or in suburbs that might have a lot of people who already go to church, although, of course, even in places like Granville, Michigan, 20-some years ago, I was involved with trying to do outreach in Granville, Michigan, and at that time, I believe it was something only like 40% of the people in Granville, which is in the Grand Rapids area, which is a very churched area, were actually consistent churchgoers. Now, what is suburbia? Roger Greenway defines suburbia. He says it like this. He says, suburbia is more of a process than a place. Suburbia is a reaction to the city, particularly the so-called inner city. He says, suburbia is a residential district separated from the central city and characterized by dwellings of about the same price. Sociologically, suburbia is homogeneous in culture. Its residents are achievers. They are on the way up socially and economically. In fact, Greenway identifies some of the challenges found in suburbia. You find that in suburbia there's a tendency towards individualism. Yes, in the city there might be communities of the poor who understand they can't get by themselves. They need support and help. In the inner cities, there can be an awareness of your neighbor. In fact, he might live very, very close next door to you. There might only be 10 feet from your front porch to his front porch. In suburbia, what can happen is that you can live on a 1-acre plot of land, for example, and so you're a bit of a distance from your neighbors, and in fact, you might not even know your neighbors. You might not know their names. You might wave to them once in a while. People who live in the suburbs are tempted by the love of money. And so the sort of self-evident needs that jump out at you in urban centers might not be so aware, even though there, of course, are great needs in suburbia. So in suburbia, people don't know their neighbors, they don't know their needs. And therefore the challenge is, how can churches in the suburbs also bring the gospel with deeds of mercy to their neighbors? Because of course it's a myth that the needs in the suburbia are in some sense any less than in the urban centers. Yes, the needs might not be that of poverty and needing money, but there's 1,000 other needs. But of course the fundamental need is the need for salvation in Jesus Christ. And that remains the same. Now, Calvinism also has something to offer suburbia, as it has something to offer urban centers. And Roger Greenway thinks that it's so important for the Reformed churches to engage in missions in suburbia and in urban missions, because the Christian faith has implications for all of life. He wishes that in urban centers there would be neighborhood churches, and that's the great danger in the suburbs, that churches are not somehow based in their communities, that so many members drive 20 miles or 10 miles or 15 miles. He thinks that in urban centers, churches should try to reach out to people within their neighborhood and then bring a full-orbed gospel to them. In fact, he has tried to argue that when white churches move out of an area, an urban center, due to white flight, that the churches should make sure that even if they're leaving, they should leave behind a self-supporting, self-propagating church, even if it's of people from a different ethnic background. And for example, he finds all kinds of objections to his proposal. People say, nonsense, blacks and Chicanos have their own kind of religion. The Reformed faith does not suit their needs. In other words, he finds people saying that somehow the Reformed faith doesn't find or can't find a point of contact among people who are from different ethnic backgrounds other than Dutch, for example. But he says, actually, these people are cutting the taproot of Reformed mission work by denying the universality of Calvinism, by saying that the Reformed faith and practice do not fit the black man or the Chicano in America. They're making the identification of Reformed Christianity with middle-class white culture. He says this is tantamount to saying that Calvinism has nothing specific to offer Nigerians, Ethiopians, or people from other ethnic backgrounds. No, his point is that the Reformed faith brings the good news of Christ crucified and the good news of the supremacy of Jesus Christ for all of life, that serves not only the welfare of the souls, but also the lives of converts. Now, what is of great importance is that in urban missions, we do need to focus on church planting. One error of the 20th century was an emphasis on outreach to urban centers that did not involve church planting. Churches in the suburbs would feel like they were doing a good work if they would try to dip their toe into the inner city by being involved in some type of word and deed ministry. But their goal wasn't to plant churches. Their goal wasn't to plant indigenous churches. Now, this is highly problematic. This is problematic in missions all around the world. Because first and foremost, what needs to occur in missions worldwide and in urban missions, and it is the planting of churches. Because God uses the planting of churches and church membership and office bearers as the means by which his kingdom comes. We could say that the Churches Institute is the engine, too, that will drive all of the other change that occurs as city dwellers embrace Christ and his supremacy. No, churches in the suburbs may not be content with just trying to develop ways to disciple and assist city dwellers who suffer from poverty or crime or broken families or wretched schools or gang-infested neighborhoods. No, churches need to be planted. And Christians in the inner city need to be raised up so that they have the gifts and qualifications to be office bearers in the Church of Jesus Christ. So the mission of the church is, first of all, to present the gospel in such a way that people are converted to faith in Jesus Christ, and having been baptized will seek membership in the visible body of Jesus Christ, the church. This is basic New Testament missionary strategy. And any method, any approach that does not seek to make converts and to establish and plant churches has departed from New Testament principles.